Okay, everybody, here we go with video number 4 for chapter 29, and in this one we're going to be talking about the end of the war with victory in Europe and the Pacific. So due to the resilience of the Allies and the United States entering the war, by 1945 the Allies were in a position to win the war. First, let's go over the defeat of Germany. By March of 1945, the Allies had pushed into Germany from both sides. All right, so you look on the map here. You've got the American and British forces coming in from the west. You've got the Soviet forces coming in from the east. Remember, after the Battle of Stalingrad, they continued to pursue the German army through Eastern Europe. And this is what the front lines were looking like by March of 1945. So Berlin, which is really right in the middle of it, is right in the crosshairs of both of those. By April, Axis forces had started to surrender left and right. And on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. He was as Berlin was being bombarded by Soviet forces, he was in his underground bunker and he chose to take his own life rather than be captured. And about a week later, on May 8th, Germany officially surrenders, and this makes this VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. All right, so all throughout Germany and other places in Europe, German forces officially surrendered to the Allies, and obviously there was mass celebration throughout the Allied countries, such as England, France, the United States, and so forth. Now, let's go through a couple of the reasons for Germany's defeat. One, they had to fight a multi-front war, right? Like we talked about here. This was similar to what they experienced in World War I. They had to fight against the Soviets in the east and the Americans and British in the west. Also, as the war went on, Hitler took more and more direct control of the military command, and he made some serious poor decisions. Hitler could inspire and rally crowds, but he was not a master strategist. He also underestimated the production capacity of the United States. The U.S. didn't just bring troops to the war. Because there was no fighting on U.S. soil, it was able to keep its factories and plants running much more productively than the other nations involved in the war. By 1944, the U.S. was producing twice as much oil as all the Axis powers combined. Germany just couldn't keep up. So Hitler and Mussolini are now dead, Nazi Germany has been defeated, and the only thing that's left is the fight for the Pacific against Japan. Following the Battle of Midway that we discussed in the previous video, the Allies were able to go on the offensive against Japan. Staging a major offensive against the Japanese islands would be next to impossible given the military technology of 1942. You couldn't just launch a plane from California, send it across the Pacific, and have bombing raids on Japan. So you needed to take control of territory that was much closer to Japan in the Pacific. This led to a strategy called island hopping. Island hopping was a strategy of recapturing the Japanese-controlled islands in the Pacific, like you see in the map here. So here's Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. There's Midway, right? The big turning point. And you notice how they're slowly working their way through the Pacific in the Philippines. And you say, well, it's not that close to Japan, but it's getting them within shooting distance and invading distance of the Japanese islands. So these islands, they would serve as stepping stones, okay? All of the islands in the Pacific, they were stepping stones to the next objective, meaning they would use a newly captured island as a base to rest troops, store materials, and launch the next attempt to then capture another island under Japanese control. The fighting for these islands tended to be bloody, such as the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. As I said, these were rough fighting, and while they were victories for the Allies, as exemplified by the iconic image of U.S. Marines raising the American flag at Iwo Jima, this is a famous, they memorialized this in a statue for World War II. So while there were victories for the Allies, it showed that the Japanese were willing to fight to the death rather than surrender. That's an important thing to remember when we talk about how the Americans eventually bring the Japanese to defeat in a little bit. And also, by 1944, the U.S. Navy had blockaded Japan. And America had taken enough of the Pacific Islands that now they could run bombing missions on Japanese cities. Well before the atomic bombs were used, Allied planes ran bombing runs over Japan, decimating cities like Tokyo. Okay, here you see an aerial view, and this is Tokyo here. You know, you'd think that this would be Hiroshima or Nagasaki after the atomic bomb, but these firebombing campaigns, it was very similar to what the Allies did in Germany. Remember, he showed pictures of German cities like Hamburg and Dresden in the previous video. So they would just carpet bomb these cities, and they did tremendous amounts of destruction. Still, this couldn't bring the Japanese to surrender. So other options needed to be considered. let's talk about the defeat of Japan. So we just discussed on the previous slide how the Japanese were showing an extreme willingness to fight to the death, and traditional bombing runs were not making them surrender. Japan still had an army of 2 million men, and the option of invading Japan was considered. Victory through this method would be long and costly for not only military casualties, but Japanese civilians as well. Another option presented itself with the results of this thing called the Manhattan Project. The purpose of this project was to create the first weapon that could harness the energy of splitting atoms, also known as the atomic bomb. And so here you see members of the Manhattan Project in front of the first tested atomic bomb. You can see how huge it was. In July of 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb took place in New Mexico. All right, and you see the iconic mushroom cloud of an atomic explosion. And it unleashed a new era in mankind's ability to use technology for destructive capabilities. Now, President Harry Truman decided to use the new weapon against Japan. All right. Now, Truman had become president after President Roosevelt, the president throughout the majority of the war, had died of illness while in office. So Truman was the vice president, so he now steps up to become president. Now, before dropping the bomb, the Allies issued a warning to Japan to surrender or face complete destruction and utter devastation. That's an exact quote from the message sent to the Japanese. The Japanese still refused. So, on August 6, 1945, an American plane dropped the atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. There you see a capture from the plane as it was flying away of the mushroom cloud, and within seconds, 4 square blocks were flattened and more than 70,000 people were vaporized. The atomic explosion creates such an intense heat that there is literally nothing left after it works its way through. Many who survived would die later of radiation poisoning released into the air. On August 8th, the Soviet Union officially declares war on Japan. Japan still would not surrender. So on the next day, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. More than 40,000 people died in this explosion. Still, the Japanese military command would not surrender. You have to remember the samurai mentality of the Japanese military command. It is better to die with honor than to surrender and lose face. The emperor, though, disagreed. On August 10th, the Emperor Hirohito intervened. This was an unprecedented move. You see, the Japanese emperor was historically a figurehead, but in this case, he demanded the military leadership surrender rather than be annihilated. Finally, on September 2nd, 1945, on the American battleship the USS Missouri, a formal peace treaty was signed. World War II was officially over. So even though the fighting was over, there was still a very, very big and important process of how to rebuild following the most destructive war in the history of mankind, and we'll get into talking about that in the next section.